for being here. It's always fun to talk about the cool work that we get to do. The way I think I'll introduce myself and my lab is by telling you about the diversity of work we do. Because unlike some other people, I can't change the slide. There we go. I don't work on a single species or even a single text. So Elise is going to talk about grizzly bears, and that's just one of the species that we think about in my lab. And that's been the case through my whole research career, is not having a taxonomic focus, but instead centering the questions that we ask around some key themes. And so these pictures that you're seeing here are just some of the organisms that I've worked on throughout my career or currently working on. And one of the key themes that I think grounds a lot of the work that I do is this idea of habitat. And I think that idea about habitat is really interesting and why I center a lot of my work for a couple of different reasons. First off, habitat for an organism is where they spend time. It's where they find their food, it's where they find their water, where they find shelter, how they meet their mates, where they find their mates, where they interact with their own and other species. And so that's a sort of a founding where we can ask lots of interesting questions about how those things play into some other quantities that we might be interested in. Things like movement and survival and reproduction and even population size. So that's just like right there to me, ripe for all kinds of interesting questions. But secondly, humans for centuries or longer have inadvertently or purposefully altered aspects of habitat. So again, another area ripe for questions is how do those changes influence all those aspects of an animal's ecology that I think are so interesting? And then to flip that on its head, you know, a lot of those times those human influences are negative on the species we think about, not always, but often. But if we think about if we can manipulate that for the negative, we can also manipulate aspects of habitat for good. So we can think about questions related to restoration, habitat management, to try and reduce or mitigate some of those influences that we might be having on species. And so if I organize the kinds of questions that we think about under this big habitat umbrella, the way I just laid it out kind of reflects how I think about things and how our work is kind of the piles that we end up working in. First off, we ask questions about what is habitat for different species and how do animals go about choosing it. If we have that foundation, then we can say, okay, when things change, often because of human-related causes, what are then the consequences on those organisms? Things like reproduction, survival, population size, movement. And then what kind of strategies can we implement for habitat management? And to me, these are inextricably tied, and sometimes we're thinking about more than one of these within the same project. So this is one big umbrella that captures a lot of our work. And we can do these projects over small spatial and time scales and try and generate some understanding. But then we can also kind of build on that knowledge to acknowledge or recognize that we live in a very dynamic world. Things are changing and continue to change. So tracking the consequences or looking at the effectiveness of restoration strategies, like that might change over space and time when you zoom out. So that brings me to the other big umbrella that centers my work is grounded under, and that's how do we track that ecological change over those longer time scales and larger spatial scales? And how do we do that reliably, given that finances are limited and we may not be able to get all the data that we want to track that ecological change? So we've got some ideas that we've worked on in my lab, asking questions about, what are the best field methods and can we improve on the field methods we used And similarly, can we improve on the quantitative approaches that we use to pull out the trends out of all the noise that is really common in ecological research? So this is kind of a framework that I use to organize my very sometimes chaotic brain, because we think about so many different species. And it's also what I'm going to use to talk through my portion of the talk today before I get to the fun idea she's been thinking about looking at for her PhD with Grizzly bears. And what I want to do is, for each of these themes, I want to highlight a project that we're currently working on. And that means I also want to highlight the students that are leading those projects. So you'll see these guys throughout the talks. Elise, you'll see in the middle, and I'll introduce the other 4 as I go on. But my students are core to everything I do. And I couldn't do all of these different species and think about all these different questions without them. So you'll see them featured on each of these projects that I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to stay pretty high level, as you can imagine, with a short amount of time. And it's not about me today, it's about Elise. So the other thing I want to acknowledge is that we always partner very closely with agencies, federal, state agencies, as well as nonprofits and other organizations. And those partners are key for the things that we do as well, because that's often how our information is applied and used on the ground to make decisions. So I'll acknowledge those key partners as well. You'll see that on the as I move forward. Okay, so back to my big habitat umbrella and the first theme that I want to feature today, and that's this idea of what is habitat for different species. And I'm sure some of you sitting there going, well, don't we kind of have that figured out for a lot of species? And that may be true for some species, but there's other species and whole species groups where there are big information gaps about this fundamental piece of information. And one of those groups are bats. And bats are incredibly diverse, and they're also really pretty elusive and hard to study. And so that means we're lacking some of this really, really basic knowledge that is absolutely essential to deal with a lot of the conservation challenges. How do we protect them or conserve them if we don't really even know what they need and where they're spending time? And so we've been exploring some of these questions for bats in Montana, characterizing the places where bats spend during the day. So at night, bats are flying around, they're foraging, they're finding water, interacting with others, but during the day, they need a spot that's going to protect them from the elements, that's going to protect them from predators, and allow them to raise their young. And that might be a tree, like in the upper left-hand corner. It might be a crack in a rock in the middle, and it might be some human-created structures, like we might be the way we encounter bats in our lives. So if we track bats to those places and characterize what those places look like, we can start thinking about how do we then protect those important structures once we know what they are. So Jacob Melchiorich is leading some of this work for his master's degree. And he is thinking about 2 species in particular that we have in Montana. First, I'll introduce you to the northern long-eared myotis in the upper left, Myotis septentrionalis. This is a species that just this year was uplisted to be considered federally endangered. And what is interesting about this species for us is we do this work in northeastern Montana. And as far as we know, that represents the westernmost edge of the species distribution in Montana, or sorry, in the US. The other species he's looking at is Myotis leucippus, which is the little brown myotis. This is a candidate for listing federally. And both of these species have distributions that extend far east, and little browns are used to be a fairly common bat, but that's changing. What Jacob is finding, which I think is really interesting, and he's still working on this, so stay tuned for more results, is that with us being on that western edge of the distribution of northern long-eared bats, is that the bats where he's doing his work are spending time during the day in very different places than what has been documented in the rest of the species range. So for the Fish and Wildlife Service, this is really important information as they characterize what is habitat for this federally threatened species and how much survey effort needs to go into places where we think there is habitat. So his information is going to be implemented and already is being implemented immediately by the Fish and Wildlife Service to update and revise what is habitat in this part of that species range. Insects are another group where we are often lacking really good habitat information and where that basic knowledge is really, really needed. So as one aspect of Carly Segal's master's work, she is looking at important habitat relationships for insects in grasslands in Yellowstone. Now we dive into some of our Yellowstone work. And Carly is working in these grasslands that maybe haven't been studied in terms of insects compared to all the different work that's been done throughout Yellowstone. So she's thinking about ideas from community ecology to inform hypotheses about insects and what habitat features might be important for different feeding groups of insects, which then we can think about, okay, what kind of structure and what kind of habitat characteristics occur across different environments in the park. All right. Once we have that basic information, we can start to explore questions of like when those habitat characteristics change, what happens to those species? Do we actually see changes in population size, reproduction, survival, movement? And I'd say this center, the second theme is where a lot of my work has been grounded. Human created changes is very widespread. So we've thought about the impacts of non-native plants, things like fire and other disturbance, climate change, recreation, all kinds of different ways that habitat characteristics might be altered and then have impacts on different species. So if we take the habitat understanding that Carly is generating about insects to say what are the important habitat features they need, we can then take the next step and say what happens when we bring in a disturbance, in this case bison, as they move throughout the park. How is that disturbance influencing those important characteristics of habitat for these different feeding groups of insects? So that's the other aspect of Carly's work that she's been thinking about. And like many disturbances, disturbance by bison is not just one thing. There's a whole gradient of intensity of that disturbance that occurs throughout Yellowstone as these herds move across and have different numbers and spend different amounts of time. So we can bring that component in to say disturbance is not just one thing. How do we think about that when it comes to communities of insects that we might think are really quite important for the functioning of ecosystems in these grasslands? Elise's work, both for her master's and the thing she's thinking about pursuing for her PhD, is also firmly in this theme. And so I'm not going to elaborate anymore on them. I'll leave this for her to share, at least what she's been thinking about pursuing for her PhD. But again, this is where a lot of my work and the work of my students has been grounded. All right, the last theme under this habitat umbrella is, what do we do when we realize that there's these effects? Are there strategies we can use for management or restoration of habitat to minimize the effects that may be considered negative in some cases? And I've been involved with a bunch of different projects on this, but it's not something I'm doing currently with any of my current students. So I'm going to theme for right now and then pivot back to this other umbrella of monitoring ecological change over longer time periods and thinking about, what happens to habitat related change of people over a longer period of time, or how do we monitor the effectiveness of restoration strategies over longer periods of time? I'm going to jump into this other side of monitoring, and I want to share two projects under these two themes of some work we're just getting started in my lab. So first off, Nolan Helmstetter is helping us think about marten. And the reason we're thinking about marten is because some concerns had been raised in Montana about how marten populations were doing. Those concerns first came out of northwestern Montana from trappers and some other individuals that thought they were seeing signs of declining marten populations. At a similar time frame, you may have seen that there's been some reintroduction efforts of marten into mountain ranges where they historically occurred but didn't currently. And then on top of all that, there's been some recent work to say we actually have two species of marten in Montana, the American marten and the Pacific marten, as well as an area of likely hybrids. So if you swirl that together, we might have some things to think about when it comes to tracking change of marten in this state. And that's where Nolan's going to come in and help us think about that. And I've put this project under this monitoring umbrella because one of the things that we're going to be thinking about is how do we develop a monitoring program for marten that balances cost with the information gained for two species, maybe some hybrids across basically the entire western portion of the state. But really, everything that's foundational to this project also falls in the habitat, because it means we need to know, do these two species use the same habitat characteristics? What happens when human-created change to that habitat through logging, fire, climate change influences these characteristics? And so all these pieces interact and are intertwined. And then the last project I'll highlight here is this idea of like what tools are available to us for monitoring. And often the gold standard in monitoring is something about abundance. What's the population size? What's the density of the population? But that's really hard to do and to do well for many of the vertebrates that we work on. We often can't count them all. We don't even see them all. So how do we rigorously estimate how many there are? And quite a few people have spent entire careers developing useful methods to rigorously estimate abundance. This is a hard thing to do. And a lot of those existing methods require we capture and mark and handle these animals and give them individual markings or ear tags, or that we work on species that have unique markings themselves, so we can better assess how many are out there and how many we're missing. But there's been some new methods just in the last handful of years that are trying to generate estimates of abundance without capturing the animals and without having unique marks on these species. And so Oscar Delling is going to be embarking on a project where we're going to try to use some of these new methods to estimate the abundance of bears in Yellowstone. And these methods capitalize on a whole array of camera traps. Yeah, camera traps aren't new, but in this case, what is new is not having these individual marks on animals, and instead looking at the patterns in the timing, where and when, essentially, where and when we capture images of the species of interest, and using those patterns to then assess how many are likely out there. So these are some methods that were developed by some researchers at the University of Montana, and we're going to try and employ them for bears and hopefully for other things in Yellowstone, because we're going to get pictures of more than just black bears and grizzly bears on those cameras. So that's one way we can increase the information that we gain for the cost and effort, which is not minimal, to get cameras out across Yellowstone National Park. So we're hoping to get at some other ecological questions and estimate abundance of hopefully a whole bunch of different things. But the effort is again, not at all trivial. So I zoom back out to the themes that structure the work in my lab on these diverse species. The other constant theme is that we're really trying to provide rigorous, useful information that then can be implemented in making conservation and management decisions. And again, that's where this close tie with the partners is so key. And I think you'll see with some of the ideas that Elise will talk about, that she's thinking about next, is that her work is under these big umbrellas, and definitely is helping us think about how do we bring good information to some really challenging questions. So I'll leave you with my contact information, and I'll hand the baton to Elise.
Thanks for coming to this. I'm excited to see you guys all here. Today I'm going to be sharing with you some of what I've been thinking about for my PhD. So I'm in my first year of my dissertation work, so I'm just going to set that expectation there. But these are some big themes that we've been thinking about, kind of transitioning off of my master's, where I'm also. Before I get started and dive into my work, I want to acknowledge that this work will be conducted on the land that's currently known as Yellowstone National Park. But many people have called this place home over a long time. And currently there are 27 tribes with ties to Yellowstone National Park, and I wanted to acknowledge their stewardship of and their connection to this land that still continues in this area to this day. So I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with a figure like this. I remember seeing this really maybe up close and personal my freshman year of college, but for many of us, this has been around for a while. And what this plot is showing is the deviation of the global yearly average temperature for each year, and whether it's been cooler or warmer from a long-term average. So as we can see, from about 1980, all of those global average temperatures have been warmer than that long-term average. And particularly for the past 5 or so years, we've been sitting around this about 1 degree Celsius deviation from normal. And when we zoom into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we've seen changes occur here already as well. So this is work that comes from the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem Climate Assessment, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, if not had a big hand in producing. But from 1950 through 2018, in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, temperature has increased 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit. Snowfall has been reduced by 25%. And stream flow, or the peak stream flow, now occurs 8 days earlier than it did historically. And these are tractable changes that we've seen already in this ecosystem, but that is projected to change into the future as well, which I'm sure we're all aware of too. So I'm sure, as you know, we don't have a crystal ball to look at the future to say this is exactly what's going to happen. But we can use, especially for climate, representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, to get some idea with some amount of uncertainty of how the climate here, and in this case temperature, is going to change into the future. And these RCPs basically describe different scenarios based on greenhouse gas emissions in atmospheric. So RCP 4.5 is if we're able to curb greenhouse gas emissions to some degree. 8.5 is kind of more of the business as usual prediction. So what does that mean for the greater Yellowstone ecosystem specifically? Temperature is expected to increase by 5.3 degrees. Growing days throughout the ecosystem, we'll see 28 to 40 more growing days per year. And I should say this is for 2100. So we're thinking out into the future. Snowpack is expected to have a 40% loss of what it was averaging around the year 2000. And precipitation, mainly in the form of rainfall, is expected to increase by 9%, mainly in the summer months. So these are some pretty big changes happening in the ecosystem, but I think it's sometimes hard to wrap our minds around what does this mean on the ground. And so cumulatively, something that I think is more maybe easy to think about spatially are the effects of fire that are going to change throughout the ecosystem. So what this plot from Westerling et al. In 2011 shows is burn intervals throughout time. So here for each column is a different simulation period. So the blue ones are from 1960 to 1990, and then we have 2070 to 2099, and each row is a different climate model. But I think what this really kind of reinforces or brings home is the fact that from the 60s to the 90s, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which is this blob, each of these cells, the burn interval, so the time between fires, was about 120 or more years. By 2070 to 2099, that is expected to increase or to decrease. So our burn interval between fires is 10 years. And I want to say that this has a caveat on it, because if you can imagine, a forest can't completely grow within 10 years. And so there's been work done since then showing kind of variations in this burn interval. The point is, it's going to decrease substantially. And with that, we're going to see vast forest regeneration failures. So we're going to be experiencing these changes as people. But other critters in this ecosystem also have to hopefully try to adapt and live with these changes as well. But they don't have the tools that we might have to mitigate changes that are directly affected on us. And here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, this is a pretty cool place to look at some of these changes, but people are also really concerned because it's one of the last nearly intact ecosystems, particularly in the lower 48, but throughout North America. And that means that the species that exist in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem today are more or less the same species that existed here pre-European. Additionally, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is this vast protected area. So Yellowstone National Park, which sits at its center, is the second largest national park in the lower 48 states. And that, combined with the forest area and the tribal lands around it, create this pretty big protected area, meaning that direct human influence on all of these lands is fairly minimal. Yes, it occurs on the outside, but within forests, within parks, it's pretty low. Additionally, the National Park Service is mandated to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and wildlife therein, and to leave these unimpaired for future generations. So you might be thinking that's a little bit paradoxical, especially considering what I just mentioned about climate change. Basically, this means that the National Park Service is supposed to manage in a way that all of our great-great-great-grandchildren can experience a similar wild that we do today. And one of the animals that is synonymous with wild, wilderness, and definitely Yellowstone are grizzly bears. This is one of the first grizzly bears that was ever collared. If you notice her radio collar, it's quite taped on there. But these icons of wilderness require quite the large area to live, which really fits hand in hand with large landscape conservation. And wild bears, grizzly bears, are a conservation-reliant species. They're also omnivores. They're incredibly plastic and individualistic species as well. And this has helped them adapt to some of the changes in the ecosystem that we've seen here in Yellowstone, more or less since grizzly bears started to be monitored and studied in the 1960s. So grizzly bears in Yellowstone National Park have had a dedicated team of researchers studying them, first with the Craighead brothers, and then with the interagency grizzly bear study team being founded in 1973. So the ecosystem is intensively studied, which is really cool to work in an ecosystem like that. But this population of grizzly bears we know a lot about. And they've had to deal with many different changes throughout that time period. So I think this plot by Cordini et al. In 2023 really depicts the changes in the ecosystem as well as the changes to the bear population pretty well in one figure. So down on this bottom panel, we have the different 4 high-calorie food resources for bears. So bears, being omnivores, they eat over 270 different species, but some of them are of higher quality than others, and these are 4 high-quality food species for grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So the brown color is bison, pink are elk, purple are cutthroat, and green are whitebark pine. But I think what's noticeable about that bottom panel is there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of fluctuation in these food resources. But then if we look at the top panel, we have the estimated count of female grizzly bears with cubs of the year. And though it's not a linear line and there's fluctuations, overall we see a growing population or a growing count of those females with cubs of the year. So collectively, this means that individual bears have been able to adapt and adapt to the changes in food resources to continue to reproduce as well as survive in this ecosystem amidst all of this change. That might seem like it's a pretty positive story so far, but we're only here and we have to go here someday. So what's going to happen to the persistence of grizzly bears in this ecosystem and in Yellowstone National Park amidst all these changes due to this change in climate? And this is where my PhD work will come in. I haven't talked this long in front of people for a while. So my PhD work, the main question that's driving this is how will climate change influence the demographics of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but specifically Yellowstone National Park. And when I'm talking about demographics, I'm specifically thinking about reproduction and survival of female bears. But I think to really understand the likely consequences of climate change, we have to think about how will the climate act on an individual, and then how is that going to scale up to changes in the population. And to do this, I think we can think about both indirect and direct effects of climate change. So a direct effect of climate change is increases in temperature, while an indirect effect of climate change are changes to the vegetation on the landscape that will be because of all of these climatic shifts. And both of those things together then act on that individual. So thinking about temperature, the bears are going to have to change their energy expenditure, their activity and movement to help them thermoregulate as it becomes warmer. And then vegetation, or these indirect effects, are going to influence things like an individual's forage availability, so what resources are available for that bear to eat, so that diet, and then to some extent thermoregulation as well, with canopy cover of forests clearly having some large changes in the future. And we don't really know that much about how climate change is going to affect grizzly bears, which is kind of surprising for them being a very large charismatic species. But some work out of Washington State University in conjunction with the interagency grizzly bear study team tried to tackle some of these questions about temperature. So Savannah Rogers, while she was at WSU, looked at the cost of thermoregulation in conjunction with activity of bears. So what these plots are showing on the y-axis is percent of the day that balance is achieved. You can think that whenever it's not 100%, they're probably under some sort of heat stress. They have to change their behavior to thermoregulate. And so on the top panel, we have non-lactating females, and on the bottom, we have lactating females, so females with offspring. And currently, what this looks like is that for both lactating and non-lactating females, in the warmer months, they have to adjust their behavior to thermoregulate when they don't have access to water or substrates to passively cool. But when they have access to water, they're able to maintain that heat balance. However, looking at this going forward, we see some drastic shifts, especially for lactating females, where they're only able to achieve their heat balance for about 12.5% of the day. So the rest of that day, they're going to have to thermoregulate, and they're going to have to change their behavior, or they can find water to passively cool in that. But if you know Yellowstone, water isn't readily available everywhere. In some areas, sure, but that's going to change into the future as well. What I think is really exciting about Savannah's work, besides the fact that we have some insights of how temperature is going to affect bears, is that it really sets the groundwork for bioenergetic models for grizzly bears. So bioenergetic models, or energy budget models, I've heard are very common in the fisheries literature, but they're not very common for large mammals, especially free-ranging large mammals like grizzly bears. And what these models do is they incorporate ingestion and digestion, so what an animal is intaking, as well as what is able to be absorbed from that. So we can think of that as our energy intake for an individual. And they integrate that with maintenance, thermoregulation, movement, and reproduction costs. So that's our energy expenditure. And ultimately, this overall balance can tell us whether individuals are meeting their energy demands, and thus whether they have enough fat as well as lean body mass to not only survive, but also to reproduce. And These energy budget models have often been created in a pretty closed system, particularly for large mammals. They're not readily applied to the ecosystems such as Yellowstone. But we know a lot about the landscape. We know a lot about how individuals and the population moves across the landscape. And so we can bring in other factors to this model, like changes in vegetation. So grizzly bears, I think I mentioned, they consume many different species, 270 species. And a lot of people think of them as eating a lot of meat resources. And while meat is sometimes important for individuals, particularly large males, females consume anywhere from 40 to 60% of their diet as vegetation. And that's both above ground vegetation and below ground vegetation. So vegetative change in Yellowstone is going to affect them directly through what they're eating in forbs and grasses, as well as those below ground roots and tubers. But it's also going to affect the herbivores that they rely on for higher calorie food resources. And Yellowstone's vegetation, you saw from the fire, or think of that fire plot again. We're going to bring that back here of how these forests are changing. And currently the park is pretty forested, but it's supposed to transition to more of a grassland savanna into the future. And I think that's sometimes difficult to wrap my mind around. Like, what does that actually mean? How much forest is going to be lost? And I think this panel from Turner et al. 2022 helps to illustrate this to some extent. So on the y-axis, we have the area of forest, and x is through time. You can disregard the different tree species if you want to, and just focus on the change from 2022 through 2100. And what we see is right now we're sitting at about 55,000 hectares of forest in the northern area of Yellowstone. By 2100, that's expected to decrease to 30,000 hectares. That's a huge decrease in forest across a pretty, or across Yellowstone in general, but across that area in particular. So one of how all of this fits together is kind of in these individual-based models. So individual-based models allow us to integrate movement, space use, energetics, and population dynamics. And by that, I'm mainly thinking about for grizzly bears, density dependence. And then these together, collectively, we can model an individual's reproduction and survival, and then that scales up into population level demographic rates. And the flexibility of these models allow us to not only integrate these, but also integrate landscape changes and that energy budget model that I mentioned earlier to really get a good understanding of what are the drivers of variation in reproduction and survival from these changes to the climate that are expected. And these models require a lot of data, but we have that here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, both in terms of landscape data, but also in terms of where grizzly bear research is at for captive individuals as well. So I think working on these models, particularly here in the GYE, is really exciting because of the historical grizzly bear data that is available for individuals out on the landscape and has been collected since the 70s, or intensively since the 70s. So we can fit this framework of individual-based and energy budget models to historic grizzly bear and landscape data to validate our results and better predict with some sort of uncertainty the future of grizzly bears in this ecosystem. So basically, we can use the past to then predict the future with some amount of uncertainty. And that's not super common to be able to do. And the grizzly bear data set that's available, especially since the year 2000, helps us be able to do this. And I also think that this approach is really useful for management because it provides insights into the future demographic rates of the population, but also it helps tease apart the mechanisms of that. And those mechanisms are what can be targeted by adaptive management of this and potentially other species as well. So grizzly bears are omnivores, and they're incredibly good at using what is available to persist on the landscape. They're not going to be a canary in a coal mine to sound that early alarm of ecosystem changes. And while the future is uncertain, my work here in my PhD aims to shed some light on the mechanisms and then those consequences of climate change. So we're better equipped to plan for this certain or uncertain future. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators. I didn't talk about my master's during this. I figured I'd just focus on my PhD, but I was fortunate enough to work with Andrea, Carrie, Frank, and Mark for my master's. And it was really fun working with all of them, so I'm excited to continue that as well as funding support. So with that, I will take questions. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. Oh, the question is, how can I use all of the data from other ecosystems, because we have a lot of it, and information to kind of project for the GYE or grizzly bears in general? For the GYE. Yeah, so grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are really unique compared to all of the other populations throughout North America. They're the southernmost, or they're at the southern extent of that current range. So what they eat is different. And so I'm going to leave that to the side because that's a huge difference. But I think a lot of what I will be working on will integrate a lot of information from other populations as well, which is, I think, one of the cool things about individual based in conjunction with these energy budget models is you can kind of combine all of these. There's been a lot of research done over decades, and we can combine a lot of that information to give us a best guess of the future. Yeah, I'm also hopefully going to be collaborating with some of those other populations. Yeah, so Jonathan's question was, what kind of data do I have? Because I said I have a lot of data. I think that's a great question. I would say the fine scale temperature data isn't necessarily there, but there's several models that can kind of interpolate these landscape temperatures to more fine scale and at different variations from the ground. And I think doing some obviously like ground truthing of that would be useful to do. That's particularly in terms of temperature. But for other data like fine scale spatial data of bears and of other resources, those are in place and there. This question is online. I think I remembered it. How do I obtain data from grizzly bears foraging behavior? Yeah, so we go to a point and it's sometimes really obvious that the bears and sometimes not. You kind of like learn it over time, but you look for evidence of grazing, a lot of evidence of digging. They dig a lot. Carcasses. With that, you can kind of piece together what they were eating, and we also at those locations will collect scat in that direct vicinity to get an idea of whether what we're seeing on the ground there, although that scat is from somewhere else, whether it's done line up from site visits as well as from scat. Cool, thanks guys.